This is the Planetary Potential Podcast for those who are eager to explore entrepreneurship, innovation, and cross-cultural communication in exciting and interesting places around the world. And now, here's your host, Andrew P. Rowan.
Welcome to episode 1 of season 1. Have you ever lived abroad and then returned to your home country only to find out you had changed more than you thought you did? Thao P sits down with me to talk through identity, social expectations, and the overall transition between moving from New York City to Saigon. My conversation with Thao turned out to be a deep dive into what it's like being a foreigner abroad and in some ways feeling like one at home, a sensation more Vietnamese will experience as they spend more time outside of Vietnam as students, tourists, or professional workers. An important reminder that opinions shared on this episode are those of individual guests. For more information, please visit www.andrewprowan.com/disclosures. Let's head to Lima, Peru to begin our introspective journey with Thao. With me is Thao P, and we are in Lima, Peru in South America. We happen to have crossed paths here, so shout out to Matt Kaliski from Rubicon Venture Capital for having introduced us earlier this year in New York City. Thao recently arrived in Lima from Ecuador, and I arrived here in Lima on Sunday from New York. We've had the opportunity to catch up here and talk about some transitions, both here in this side of the world, the Western Hemisphere, but also back in Vietnam, which is where Thao is from. So welcome, Thao.
Thank you, Andrew. It was such a pleasure and such a delight to accidentally bump into you in in the middle of South America here. So I originally moved to the US to study for college there for 4 years and then work in New York for Indiegogo for 2 years. And it was a very tough decision for me to decide to move back to Vietnam because I really, really love New York and I'm enchanted by the energy of New York. But then seeing the potential in Vietnam and reflecting on how much I miss the culture in Vietnam, I think I should take a chance to go back to Vietnam and see what are the opportunities there. My plan there now is traveling South America for 2 months. I have about a month left, and then I'm moving back to Vietnam, moving to Saigon, and then try to find a job, get hopefully connected with the startup community there and get used to the environment in Vietnam, see what are the challenges there. And my hope is to start something new to try to solve the problems in Vietnam.
So you're from Hanoi originally.
Yeah.
Although you have plans to move to Saigon
Yeah.
when you go back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And you mentioned specifically culture. Of course, the culture in the U.S. is different compared to the culture in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And having lived in Vietnam myself, I do see a greater emphasis on the value of family,
Yeah.
especially close-knit family,
Yeah.
and also the reverence that Vietnamese society has for teachers
Yeah.
and professors in a way that is in stark contrast at times
Yeah.
to the reputations of teachers in the U.S. I also appreciated having family versus not having family in a new locale. So when I was in Vietnam, I didn't have any family. Of course, some family members did come to visit me, but that's very
Yeah.
different. And when you were living in the States, similarly, you did not have family
Yeah.
there, which I know contributed to your decision to return to Vietnam and spend more time closer to family.
Yep.
Here in Latin America, where we currently are, there's also a huge emphasis on the value of family.
Yeah.
Certainly, I'd say it's a greater emphasis than the U.S. And at the same time, there seems to be more elements of community.
Yeah.
Based on what I've seen here in Lima
Yeah.
and what I've heard as well. I know that some foreigners who have recently relocated to Lima have shared that when they first arrived, they were receiving invitations to dine at fellow community members, but Peruvians' homes.
Yeah.
And this was a way to establish rapport, establish a relationship, very similar to Vietnam in the sense that you have a series of interactions, coffee meetings
Yeah.
to build up the relationship
Yeah.
and to eventually reach a point where you're comfortable enough to do business
Yeah.
with each other. So I thought that was an interesting similarity between here in Lima and a place like Vietnam. US, of course, is a bit more transactional
Yeah.
in the sense that get the contracts out because the lawyer will take care of some of the risks, or the language will help to arbitrage
Yeah.
some of that risk. And wondering if that was a difficult transition when you moved to the US initially,
Yeah.
and also looking ahead, if you have any concerns about reintegrating into Vietnamese society, because now you've
Yeah.
been outside for 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And well, things have changed, especially when I first went to Vietnam in 2011
Yeah.
and then moved to Vietnam in 2013 compared to today.
Yeah.
There have been quite a few changes. So could you please share a bit more about what the challenge was transitioning to the US, and then also what you expect might be some challenges returning to Vietnam?
Yeah. I think Vietnam and the US are really the two ends of the spectrum in terms of privacy and community. So the US is like the extreme of privacy, and Vietnam is the extreme of community. In the US, it might appear that everyone is so friendly to you. Everywhere you go, they say, "How are you? Hi." But actually, they don't care about how you really are. They just want you to say, "Good, how are you?" back, and then you move on. But in Vietnam, like they really want to know, get into the weed of how you really are. And sometimes you don't have your personal identity when you live in Vietnam, because like your identity is a sum of everyone's expectation of you. So with that, when I first moved to the US, I didn't have any personal identity. So I got into an identity crisis a little bit, because now I have no direction. No one is telling me what to do, where to go. So it was tough in the beginning. And then the other challenge is that I was missing the warmth of the people from Vietnam when I was in the US, because it's it's hard to get an emotional connection with Americans in the US. So I really miss that. But now but like it was a great opportunity for me to find out who I am and develop myself personally, really trying to see what I like, who I am in the US, because I would never have the same amount of time to be alone anymore. And now I think moving back to Vietnam, it will be the biggest challenge for me to keep myself true to me. So be really firm with what I believe, what I like, because now I know that like people will have judgment on me and they will have expectation of me. So that will be a challenge of moving back.
Yeah, so I do agree with you that there are these communication rituals, especially when it comes to, hey, how you doing? And expecting the only answer to be, great, how are you?
Yeah.
But if you were to respond something else like, oh,
Something longer, they wouldn't listen to you.
yeah, I don't think it would be processed. I think it would just be moving on to the
Yeah.
next segment of the conversation. And that's in stark contrast to, at least in my experience, people asking many questions of Vietnam.
Yeah.
The rationale being because they care
Yeah.
about like how you're doing, where
Yeah.
you're going, what's going on. Even the act of gift giving,
Yeah.
you give someone fruit,
Yeah.
right? Because you care for their good health.
Yeah. Yeah.
To be healthy. On the topic of expectations, I'm wondering if there were some social pressures that you became aware of after some time in the US. So what I mean by that is when I was in Vietnam, the first 6 months were very different from the next 18 months, which were very different from the next 2 years after that. So another way to frame that is the questions I had at 6 months inside Vietnam were very different from the questions I had at 2 years in Vietnam versus 5 years at Vietnam. Once I became more aware of the culture, once I became aware of the regional differences, having lived in different cities across Vietnam. So I'm wondering, because I know you spent time in Massachusetts, and then you moved to New York City, and well, of course, there are different regional cultures still on the East Coast, but different regional cultures. And wondering, as the more time you spent in the U.S., if you became more aware of certain social pressures related to your identity as first an international student, right? And then as a New Yorker.
I think in college, the influence or the influence was mainly like what am I studying and what kind of social activities that I'm doing. But I get more opportunities to form my identity when I moved to New York, because for the first time in 20 years, I have no guidance or agenda to tell me what to do next. So it was a lot of pressure in deciding what should be my future. So that's not only about career, but also what I like to do and what type of friends that I want to hang out with. It's a lot of decision at the same time. When I first moved out of somewhere that I've been used to for 4 years, and also move out of a structured education system.
So in some ways, you were kind of taking a leap then to move to New York City. And in that sense, so much of our identity is tied to work, right, to employment. In the US, not sure it's the same in Vietnam. Of course, yes, there's a component of that. But for your return, what are some of the other social pressures beyond work that you're thinking about or you might be concerned about? Because at this point, like, you're most used to U.S. style things, right? And things have changed a bit in Vietnam in terms of private sector development, the economy, the growth, but also the things that I think were once familiar, that seemed familiar, might have transformed, at least on a superficial level. The cityscape, so to speak, in Hanoi. There were times where I noticed one day a building would be there, the next day it would be gone, and then you could see on the third day already scaffolding going up to completely transform an element of that street. So curious again, what might be some different social pressures that you're aware of in Vietnam? Of course, your family wants you to stay close, right? Typically, you live with your family in Vietnam and in Vietnamese culture until you're ready to move out, which is usually because of marriage. The loophole in that, in I guess Hanoi, is to move down to Saigon, right? And so there are many Hanoians who move to Saigon. And then usually what ends up happening is the Saigonese go to Singapore or elsewhere. If it's not social influence or social pressure, what are you looking forward to the most when you return to Vietnam?
So to answer your question about social pressure, I'm not excited about this, but it's an apparent concern of my parents. I think they care more about my potential to marry than career, to be honest. And I think this is a major concern of every parents who have a daughter. So they would prefer the daughter to marry into a good family, a good guy, and have beautiful, healthy children more than anything that that the daughter is hoping to pursue career wise.
And well, that sounds like somewhat of a traditional mindset. Although very common still in
I think it's pretty common
in Vietnam today. And have your parents been direct in expressing these concerns to
Yep.
you? So no hints, just like straight up
Yeah.
telling you like, be careful because the time that you're
Yeah.
spending on your career, you're wasting by not trying to find a suitable partner.
Yeah, like they would express it by making comments about my appearance. Like you, for example, you look too dark recently, no one's gonna marry you. And I paid a visit to Vietnam just like 2 months ago, and they tried to set me up with a guy who is a son of our neighbors.
I see. Because
Yeah.
they know the neighbor's family.
Yeah,
They know.
they don't know anything about the guy, but they know the neighbor family is a good family.
I see.
Yeah.
So how far along did they get in their mission? Like, did they convince you to meet the guy?
Yeah, so they invited the entire family to my house to
Wow.
have lunch.
What was it a surprise for you?
Yeah, it was a surprise for me. At first, I just thought that it's our neighbors visiting me.
Yeah.
But then during lunch, the atmosphere was getting kind of weird because all the attention were getting upon me and the guy.
So you guys were sitting next to each other.
Yeah,
Uh-huh. So your parents didn't tell you the purpose of the lunch,
yeah,
and they're like, "Oh, the neighbors will come
yeah,
and join us."
yeah,
And so you join them, and then during the lunch, it was revealed the
yeah,
true purpose.
yeah.
How did you feel when you found out in that moment?
I was a little bit upset but I tried to be polite with the family and with the guy. But then after that, they wanted us, my family, to pay another visit to the other family by having lunch over there because they think it's a courtesy to like do a like home visit to the other family.
And to reciprocate.
Yeah, reciprocate. But then I was very mad and I didn't accept to that, and we got into a very big argument with my mom. It's one of the challenge that I will have to deal with when I move back to Vietnam too, is how to maintain my stance and not hurting and making my family sad, because obviously my mom and my dad has a very different idea of what a happy life is, and I know that they're worried about my happiness, that's why they're doing this. But definitely my sense of happiness is very different now since I have had the time to reflect on myself abroad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the topic of happiness then, what have been some of the happiest moments for your trip?
So the highlight of the trip, there's so many highlights. Yeah. The nature is just amazing, and I didn't believe that the scope of nature would be this way before getting on the trip. So I visited Galapagos in Ecuador, and it's a dream for marine life lover to visit one of the most biodiverse spot in the world. And yeah, and I couldn't believe all the different type of fishes and sharks that I've seen. And then there's Peru and Huaraz. I did a 4-day trek there. If heaven exists, I hope that it looks like that.
So, yeah, it sounds like you made some great memories. It's a bit of a capstone to your time here in the Western Hemisphere. And along that theme, the positive theme, what are you looking forward to in terms of creating new memories in Vietnam?
Yeah.
Because there's also some quite nice biodiversity in Vietnam. For example, the largest cave in the world, Sơn Đông.
Yeah.
And which we spoke about a little bit before. Would you have plans to visit that cave eventually?
Yeah, I think eventually. And I'm excited to be in the middle of Asia again. So it will be much easier for me to travel to different countries there. In the US, it was a little bit lonely because the US is so big, so you are far away from everything.
You need a car really to get.
Yeah, to go everywhere. But I think in Vietnam, it's pretty much close to not only different cities, but also different countries. So it will be much easier for me to travel.
So it sounds like you're looking forward to traveling using Vietnam and, of course, Saigon as a base to travel within the region.
Yeah.
And well, along those lines, then, do you have any countries in particular that you want to prioritize for travel?
Yeah, I want to go to maybe not prioritize like all different countries in Southeast Asia. I think it's a good spot.
So would it be a similar travel trip like this one where you block out 2 months and then you go around traveling? Or would it be like shorter weekend getaways?
Yeah, it would depends on what kind of job that I'm taking on in Vietnam now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on that topic, then what would be your ideal job in Vietnam? And it doesn't I'm not asking like what company necessarily, but what kind of environment are you looking for in terms of where you can contribute?
Yeah.
What are the benefits
Yeah.
that you are looking for in a job in Vietnam? And I don't mean like workplace benefits, but what kind of style for contribution? What are the aspects, the priorities that you're looking for in a role and in an organization?
Yeah. So one of the reason why I decided to move back to Vietnam is because I want the flexibility and the freedom to choose to try out different industries. In the US, I think the industries have been long and the economy has been long enough that there has been a concentration of industries in certain cities. So for example, New York, that would be advertising, finance, fashion, for example. But if you want tech, you move to California. And if you want agriculture, then the Midwest in the middle of the US. So you can't really choose a city and choose the industry that you want at the same time. But then with Vietnam, since everything is so new and it's a lot smaller than the US, in Saigon, you would be able to find all the different industry that you want to give a try out. So I'm very interested in a few industries that I want to try out. That includes agriculture, logistic, manufacturing, and I know that's a lot already. I'm also like mildly interested in city management. So I don't know that will lead me, but Vietnam definitely will give me more flexibility in terms of trying out different industries.
Yeah, so when you say that you're interested in trying out different industries, do you mean that you want to connect with people in those industries and have access to asking them questions, complementing any research that you do to see if there's an opportunity for you to add value? You mentioned at least 3 industries. One
Agriculture
area.
is it's food and agriculture is one of my top curiosity subject.
And that curiosity stems from
From
what exactly?
Stem from so I'm a minimalist. There are very few things that I care about. I don't promote over consumerism, so I don't promote using unnecessary products. I don't care much about fashion anymore, so I cross that out. But food is essential to everyone, and it's essential to everyone. It's not only cultivate your body for your health, but also it's a culture, especially a very big culture in Vietnam. So I think everyone growing up in Vietnam naturally has a major interest in food. And I think now Vietnam has a big concern in food safety and agriculture practice. So having seen what has happened in the US, the kind of agriculture industry that is growing into, I want to be able to shape the future of agriculture and food in Vietnam.
And of course, we both like good food.
Yeah.
Everybody does, right?
Yeah. Vietnamese food is too good to ignore.
So, on that note, what is the dish that you miss the most
Yeah.
from Vietnam?
Oh, there's so many. You asked me this, and it's really hard to choose one. I can name 10 easily.
Okay, how about 5 then?
So bún chả,
Yeah,
bún
with you there.
riêu, phở, bánh cuốn,
Oh, wow.
and bánh bột lọc.
Just missing Bia Hanoi, right?
Yeah, Bia
Bia
Hanoi.
Truk back.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure once you're back in Vietnam, you will have a lovely time
Yeah. Thank you.
experiencing the wonderful cuisine
Yeah.
that is Vietnamese food. Although, as I understand, you'll only be in Hanoi for a week before heading down south. So you got to get in all that northern deliciousness in
Yeah.
before heading south. Speaking of Saigon and Hanoi, you've previously lived in Saigon for 3 months, right?
Yeah.
But beyond that, not much experience
Yeah.
in Saigon. What is it that drew you to Saigon?
Yeah.
Like, why are you deciding?
My first reason is to be away from my family. So I'm moving from the US to Vietnam to be close to my family, but not too close.
Yeah, I hope they're not listening, but I understand.
Yeah. So,
Oh, yeah, it's good to be close, but not too close.
but not too close.
Yeah, only a 2-hour plane ride
Yeah.
away.
And if I decide to stay in Hanoi, it's not very socially acceptable that I live separately, especially as a woman from my family. So it's better to move to a different city entirely. And also, I think I was very inspired by the energy in Saigon when I was interning there about 3 years ago. And I feel like the people there are more open to new ideas, to meeting new people. I just have this feeling that I would be able to adapt better in Saigon, having had that Western influence in the US.
There are several expat communities across Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I recall when I lived in Saigon, many French, Brits, and Australians.
Yeah.
And in the north, there were different communities up there compared to Saigon. But wondering if you will have a special, let's say, affinity for the American community because you've lived in the US.
Yeah.
And of course, you are a natural ambassador and bridge builder between US style and Vietnamese style. Have you thought about that role that you might play in trying to help bridge that gap, so to speak, between cultures? Because you are well experienced in American workplace culture, American culture in general, at least on the East Coast. And having been, well, a native daughter of Vietnam,
Yeah.
of course, you know Vietnamese culture.
Yeah.
Have you given that much thought, or is it more focused on your career and professional aspirations?
Yeah, I don't have any specific plans about helping Vietnamese students studying abroad yet, but I do encourage Vietnamese students to, at least in their life, study abroad in either in the US or in Europe, or other countries, because I think that my experience in the US was very beneficial in a way that, first, it's like foreseeing the future, because Vietnam the US is already a developed country. It has tested and tried a different model of growth. And since Vietnam is a developing country, it's trying to catch up the US in a lot of way. But the US, they have tried a lot of different ways to get to where they are now. And if you have seen like all the history of their development, you can pick and choose what step you take and what step you don't take. For example, with agriculture in the US, a major transformation in industrialization. Now there is a movement of going back to small farming and organic farming, which ironically used to be very popular in Vietnam, but now Vietnam is picking up on the industrialization part and they are forgetting the organic part. But for example, if we were able to foresee that and know that like after industrialize, the US would regret of their decision in that way, and we only focus on small farming and organic farming, we would have a better head start in the future, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely value to be gained from learning from best practices, but also missteps from other countries that are further along the path of development. And I hope also, not just in agriculture, but in other areas, that Vietnam and other countries can learn from.
Yeah.
For example, having such car-centric cities
Yeah,
in the US,
exactly.
where everything is spaced out.
Yeah. And now the city design movement is to get rid of cars and get rid of suburban areas because everyone gravitate towards city. They don't like living in the suburbs anymore.
One of the recent city features I noticed in Hanoi was this walking street around Ho Gươm.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's one of the best decisions that was made by Nguyen Kim district.
Yeah, I agree.
Because the atmosphere on the weekend, so I believe the walking street is open from Friday evening until Sunday evening. And the atmosphere there is at sometimes akin to a carnival.
Yeah.
In terms of people playing music.
Yeah.
You have games on the street.
Yeah.
Young families everywhere, children everywhere.
Yep.
And it's really, I think, one of the more unique experiences that I've had in Vietnam, where every time I experience it, I'm always surprised by how wonderful it feels being able to walk around without fear of being run over by a car or hit by a motorbike. Yeah. And it's a bit surprising too because of the number of cars that are being introduced every day to Vietnamese roads.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that there are some policymakers that have the foresight to focus more on pedestrian privatization, so to speak. I know it's not the only one, of course. In Ho Chi Minh City, you have Nguyen Hue, which had the walking street revitalization. Hue City also has a walking street area. And it's, to me, I think one of the best decisions that I've seen Vietnamese cities undertake to help, again, promote that sense of community.
Yeah.
Right? Getting all the people out together among each other as one. Of course, in U.S. cities, even New York City, there's some walking areas. Some areas have been converted to dedicated pedestrian areas, especially around Times Square and Midtown and such. Though not to say that cities in the U.S. aren't doing that as well.
Yeah.
But it's very different because in Vietnam, especially when getting a car is celebrated so much in Vietnam, in both the workplace and in the neighborhood. And it's just a different approach, I think.
Yeah. And that used to be the case in the U.S. too. Cars used to be the status of the owner.
Yeah.
So, but now bicycles are celebrated and walking is celebrated instead of cars. So I can, having been in the US and stay there, I can easily see the future of walking and biking in Vietnam too.
Yeah. When do you expect that future to be realized in Vietnam?
Hopefully sooner than the US, because like you can see the residues of a car culture in the US by seeing how many highways and suburban areas have been built around cars and not with people in mind. And I hope that future infrastructure in Vietnam is built around people and built around walkability of cities instead of
Yeah.
cars, because cars is not only it's it's a very wasteful vehicle. Usually only one person occupy a four people car, and
Yeah.
it's not environmental friendly. It occupy a lot of space, so infrastructure tends to be more expensive if it's built around car too. So I see a lot of reason why cities should be walkable and bikeable.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly quite biased because I love to bike.
Yeah. I love to walk.
There we go.
Yeah.
Good complimentary. I think the urban development and design in Vietnam will have to change certainly in the next 15 to 20 years as the population ages.
Yeah.
As people become older in Vietnam, they
Yeah.
just won't have the same mobility as
Yeah.
before. So this means that architects and city designers will have to create more accessible spaces
Yeah.
for older people to
Yeah.
maneuver in. If they are in wheelchairs, to have access into spaces that they did not have access to
Yeah.
before. It's just a matter of fact of senior care
Yep.
and senior living. I hope that these changes are implemented sooner than later, because the longer it takes to implement, the higher the transformation costs will be
Yeah.
for not just the city, but I think for society as well. It can be disruptive when it's not built into the design from inception. And also wondering what might be the biggest sort of takeaway of the lesson that you learned from your time in the US, or what's something that surprised you either about yourself or about American people or about the country in general that you just didn't expect or wasn't on your radar before living, studying, and working in the US?
One of my biggest surprise is that when I was in Vietnam and before I actually live in the US is like a model to the people who live in Vietnam. So if I want to grow Vietnam and to help view the country, I will look towards the US. But now, having lived in the US, I have seen the darker side of the US. There is so much inequality in the US, a lot more than I've seen in Vietnam. So that is one.
So you can see up close the good and the bad.
Yeah, the good and the bad.
But before, when you were in Vietnam,
Yeah.
the US is like such a big country, such a strong country.
Yeah.
And this
So
is something
glamorous.
Yeah, this is something I experience a lot in Vietnam, is when people would ask me, where are you from? And I tell them the US. Oh, US number one.
Yeah.
Like,
So một.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then also, I think somebody asked me once why I thought that the vast majority of people in Vietnam had a favorable impression of the US. And I think it was one of two things, like what is portrayed in the media, but also lack of travel experience. Right? So there's, for a good portion of the people who talk about US, in everyday life, in the streets, like I would go to the gym and they would tell, somewhat and all this stuff. I don't think they had actually been to the US and had traveled to the US and traveled across the US. Or if they had, it was, as tourists maybe. And, let's face it, the US has a great reputation, has a great brand. Right? So it's very difficult, I think, to come to a different conclusion, even after having having lived in the U.S., right? I mean,
Yeah.
it must not have been easy to realize that, you're absolutely right. Inequality is a huge challenge for the
Yeah.
U.S. It's not the only one. Uh, Amount of gun violence that's in the
Yeah.
U.S. is shocking.
Yeah, it's shocking.
And it's hard to juxtapose it sometimes to
Yeah.
all the good and say some really wonderful qualities that the U.S. has.
Yeah.
So I understand why that might
Yeah.
be jarring. Anything on the individual level? Because of course, leaving Vietnam
Yeah.
for the first time to study by yourself, it takes courage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, I think, part of a growth transformation.
Yeah.
And I think we spoke about this a little bit, but wondering if your experiences, if you feel they have given you an increased sense of confidence.
Yeah.
And is that also one of the benefits of
Yeah.
having lived in a different country?
Yep, definitely. I think I have gained a lot sense of confidence when I was in the US. I think I was a much less secure person in like only just 2 years ago. I was thinking about why I'm so insecure about myself and went through a lot of reflection about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like the long time, the excessive alone time in New York afford me to think so much about myself like this. And I realized that the reason why I'm so insecure is because I'm very critical of myself.
Mm.
Like for example, with other people, I would I would not as critical about other people as
Yeah.
I am to myself. So after having acknowledged that, I had to redevelop a relationship with myself, finally accept who I am. I think before you aspire and try to achieve anything in your life, you have to start with cultivating yourself first.
Hmm. So I agree with you. I think that in general, we are more critical of ourselves.
Yeah.
And, well, I think that can be good and bad.
Yeah.
It can be positive and negative.
Yeah.
Of course, if you hold yourself to high standard,
Yeah.
but it's a fine line between that and holding yourself to impossibly high standards.
Yeah.
Not giving yourself credit where credit is due, not giving yourself some breaks.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that for sure. How did you help to reestablish the relationship with yourself?
Yeah.
Was that something that sort of clicked automatically for you, or was that a gradual process? Were you aware that you needed to reestablish your relationship with yourself, or did you already start doing that and then became aware that you were doing it in the process?
I think awareness is key, and then everything will roll over gradually. So you have to be aware that you are torturing yourself when you're doing it.
When you're reestablishing the relationship, or not having a reestablished relationship? Which one is the torture?
The torture for me is telling myself that I'm not good enough.
I see.
Yeah. And just tormenting myself whenever I make a mistake.
Mm. And how about now when you make mistakes today?
Yeah.
You still must be annoyed or frustrated somehow,
Yeah.
right? But is it not as heightened? Is it not as acute, that sense of frustration,
Yeah.
or dread or anxiety?
Now, whenever I make a decision, I reassure myself that this is the best decision that I can make at the moment with the amount of information that I have.
Yeah.
So later on, I don't torment myself about that anymore, even though I make a mistake, because yeah, at the time that's the only information that I can have, And that's the best decision that I can make at the time.
Yeah, well, in fact, I don't think that you can have perfect information
Yeah.
in order to make a decision. Well, certainly, it's not very realistic in
Yep.
decision making in the everyday life,
Yeah.
or at least in some more important decisions
Yeah.
in life. But in the process of actually resetting the relationship, was it just a matter of letting go
Yeah.
of that weight
Mm-hmm.
that you had been carrying? And I imagine it must have felt liberating
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah.
And do you think that process is something that you could have undergone had you not traveled or lived abroad?
I think I could have had the same experience
Mm-hmm.
if I had just had a lot of time to myself and not having a lot of social influence.
So that time that you spend alone,
Yeah.
reflecting,
Yeah.
kind of ruminating over some things,
Yeah.
that was deeply helpful
Yeah.
towards you reaching a point where you realized that you were just too harsh on yourself.
Yeah. Too harsh on myself. And the re-establishing relationship with myself is keeping a new mantra about myself that my self-worth is not dependent on my achievement and not dependent on my characteristic. Self-worth is inherent and it's
Innate.
innate.
Mm.
So even though if I meet someone who is at a much more senior role than I am, I don't feel insecure anymore because role and status doesn't mean that I'm less worthy than the person is.
And at the end of the day, we all put our pants on the same way.
Yeah.
One leg at a time.
Exactly. we're all heartbroken, broken.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
love still burns us at the same level.
Very fiercely.
Yeah.
So, looking a bit ahead in Vietnam, are you at all concerned that some of that critical self-review
Yeah.
will reemerge
Yeah.
in Vietnamese society, being among Vietnamese society? Because
Yeah, definitely.
when I lived in Vietnam, folks were very happy to tell me that I was fat all the time.
Oh, yes. Oh my God.
I remember I stopped by an old by me
Yeah.
shop and I told her, "Oh, I moved." And she says, "Yes, and more fat."
Yeah.
And well, on one hand you get used to it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's like this bombardment of
Yeah.
messaging towards you.
Yep.
And it's this kind of cycle
Yeah.
that ends. Even if you're viewed as beautiful or handsome or attractive,
Yeah.
it's always like bestowed upon you,
Right.
no matter what in Vietnamese society. It's
Yeah.
like this urge to share,
Yep.
like,
Opinion.
to tell you,
People are very generous with their opinions of you.
yeah, like, did you know? Did you
Yeah.
know that you're fat? In terms of being back in Vietnamese society, is that something that you're aware of? And
Yep.
are you concerned that
Yep.
it'll impact you in a negative way? Because
Yeah.
it sounds like in a way, the time you've spent outside of Vietnam,
Yeah.
alone in New York, you've achieved this peace with yourself.
Yeah.
And if not peace, then this comfort,
Yeah.
this balance with yourself.
Yeah.
And then now that you're in another environment, well, the balance could
Yeah.
shift.
Definitely. Yeah. I think you capture it very well. The social pressure in Vietnam. So if you are any different than the social standard, opinions will be placed upon you so you can follow the line or the standard again. And one of my recent experience is when I was back home for Tết this year, which is the Lunar New Year in Vietnam. a lot of relatives haven't seen me for years, and they were very surprised by my short hair. So a lot of people commented on how ugly I am and how boyish I am. And at first I was very, very upset. So yeah, like when I go back to Vietnam, it will be a challenge for me to maintain this peace with myself and not be affected by opinions.
Yeah, I think that's always challenging, especially because in some ways, the closer we are to people, I think the more comfortable we are telling them harsher things.
Yeah.
Especially like things that you might share with your family. I don't think you would say to strangers
Yeah.
on the street. But yeah, I certainly appreciate how being on the receiving end of comments like that would be certainly hurtful and frustrating
Yeah.
because the mindsets are completely different.
Yeah.
You know, they are, and in the way that they think they're helping you
Yeah.
by telling you these
Yeah.
things.
Like, do you know you're fat? You
And
should be on a diet.
and it's like I've done my job.
Yeah.
I've told Tao that she's fat and she looks like a boy, and now
Yeah.
she's gonna change because of it. So
Yeah.
like, good for me and good for her.
Yeah.
I saved her.
Yeah.
It's difficult sometimes
Yeah.
to figure out some inner motivations
Mhm.
from that side.
Yeah, I think there is a line between what I would appreciate opinions on and what I don't. So, for example, for things that is personal taste
Yeah.
or something that I just cannot change, like appearance, like my habits, or like my hobbies, for example, I would not appreciate opinions on. But for things that like I actively seek for constructive feedback.
Yeah.
I think Vietnamese are very good at giving honest feedback. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree. I think in general, once you find people whom you trust in Vietnam,
Yeah.
they're good at providing that candid feedback to
Yeah.
you, especially in a private environment.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you're going to offer criticism, don't do it in public.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good rule of thumb.
Yeah. Vietnamese are very scared of losing face.
Yeah, well, nobody likes to be criticized
Yeah.
publicly, but you're absolutely right, especially on the topic of feedback. If folks out there listening are interested in connecting with you in Vietnam, either because they have an opportunity in one of the industries you mentioned, agriculture, logistics, manufacturing, or city planning, what's the best way that they can reach out to you in a respectful way, the way that you would want them to?
Yeah. So you can reach me at Thao, THAONP279 at gmail.com. And I will be happy to chat with anyone because I will be entirely new in Vietnam.
Yeah, you'll be in some ways like an outsider
Yeah, an outsider again.
in Vietnam. It'll certainly be an exciting experience.
Yep.
And I wish you the best. Of course, please keep us updated on your journey as you progress.
Yeah.
And until next time, Tam.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Take
Vietnam
care.
will miss you.
Well, it's mutual.
Yeah.
And hopefully the next time we meet
Yeah.
will be somewhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And we can look back on this time and also look forward to some new memories.
Yeah.
So all the best until next time, and take care.
And there you have it. The inaugural episode is in the books. I'm grateful to Thao for sharing her experiences with us and for being candid about the challenges she expects to face ahead. Check out the show notes for more information about Thao. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, or a review. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us next week when we'll be in Piura, which is near the border with Ecuador. In the meantime, feel free to reach out directly to me if you'd like to learn more information about the Planetary Potential Podcast, or if you'd like to learn more about upcoming interviews. Thank you.